Thank you, Professor Kondapalli. And thank you, FNVA and Mr. Tandon, Mr. Rebon Banerjee for inviting me today to speak to this distinguished gathering. The topic, as you all know, is China's new leadership and its relations with India. And I think that's a good beginning to look at how the policy alternatives will shape up. And a starting point, in my view, would be the 18th Party Congress, which we've just seen the conclusion of. It marks an crucial stage, it's an important stage in the Chinese Communist Party's evolution. And to my mind was a success for the party's veteran leadership, who ensured that the Party Congress carried through the handover of power to the designated successor leaders quite smoothly. The Congress is different from earlier Congresses that have been held insofar as there was a marked absence of a veteran leader, a long march leader on the sidelines. The person chosen as the General Secretary of the party had not been selected earlier by any of the veteran leaders. In fact, the last such choice was Hu Jintao. The installation of the top echelons of cadres who grew up during the CCP and I think during the Cultural Revolution, I think this is the most important point, that all those who've been installed today are people who joined the Chinese Communist Party during the Cultural Revolution and grew up there. Some of them, in fact, personally suffered during those tumultuous years, and of them I would point to the princelings. 4 of them who are in the 7-member Politburo Standing Committee, and some of whom personally suffered. But despite that, they joined the Chinese Communist Party and rose through the ranks, indicating a kind of determination or commitment to the ideology of the party. The Chinese Communist Party itself has been through a rough period in the last year. In fact, I would say that it was severely disrupted, and the Chinese Communist Party leadership was stunned and shocked by the Po Xilai incident. This is the first time in decades, in fact, that a senior cadre of the Chinese Communist Party actually, and with such an impeccable red revolutionary pedigree, made efforts to acquire a personal base in the PLA, in the security apparatus, and among the people, almost like an American politician trying to run for elections. But that is what he tried to do, and in the process, instead of just ensuring his position or his candidature for the Politburo Standing Committee, what he did was he projected himself or created an impression that he was an alternate power center, much to the discomfiture of Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping, who decided that it is time to get rid of him. They joined hands and they moved him out. In the process, of course, there were a lot of politics that were played. There was a lot of manipulation that was done, and the Chongqing public security chief, Wang Lichun, was an instrument used by the Beijing leadership. The rest is all history as to how he sought shelter in the US consulate in Chengdu, how the charges were levied, and what light punishment he got, etc. But the party learnt a lesson through the Po Xilai incident. They realized a few things. The first was that their monitoring of senior cadres in the party was not adequate, and that had to be strengthened. There was no question of party cadres being allowed to violate party discipline and fall prey to foreign intelligence services, as was the case with Wang Lichun. They also felt that the public security apparatus needs to be cleansed, and as you all know, about 3,500 people were sent for political education after this incident. Finally, the decision was taken that the ideological education in the party and political education needs to be intensified, and there have been successive programs that were initiated for that, particularly in the PLA. In fact, there was an article, I remember, in the PLA around July in the Liberation Army Daily, which spoke, it was an article written by a senior political commissar, and it spoke about the emergence of factions in the PLA. This is the first time that we've seen that after so many years. However, um, with this jolt that the party suffered, the fact that the party Congress went through was, I think, quite creditable. But there was also something else in the background that was developing in China, and that was the discontent, the widespread discontent that had spread through the country, and a lot of disenchantment. There were a lot of calls for political reform, which actually piggybacked on the calls for economic reform. And a number of the liberal economists, including, in fact, Sun Liping, who is Xi Jinping's tutor, was at one time, also made calls for economic reform. And in fact, he went a bit further by saying that social instability or social unrest was being used as an excuse by the security forces to try and install the reform process. Anyway, the number of protests rose from 180,000 in 2010, according to a confidential estimate by the Tsinghua University, at the rate of almost between 8 to 12% a year. And study or a report in the Blue Book issued by CAS last year, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, pointed out that the people were beginning to lose confidence in the government. The party itself took measures to try and tackle the situation. They were very concerned about social stability management, which is the euphemism for public security and law and order. And what they did was boosted the domestic security budget. And for the last 2 years, the budget has been higher than the national defense budget, and this is the first time that this has happened. Meanwhile, the netizens in China have become very active indeed. And if one looks at the cyberspace, at Sina Weibo and Tencent and others, one sees a lot of critical blogs appearing. All kinds of blogs talking about the amount of money that cadres are making and spiriting out of the country, talking about the luxurious luxury living and lavish lifestyles of party cadres, the amount of money that party cadres have made and things like that. And they've in fact, immediately after the party congress, there were at least 2 cases where senior functionaries were named by prominent individuals, including former deputy editors of Kachin, etc. So there is a kind of shall I say, effervescence which the party leadership would say is of the wrong kind taking place on the in cyberspace. And this was reflected when the 18th Party Congress was held in Beijing. Security was very high. They drummed up 1.4 million volunteers to look after the 2,000 odd delegates. And some netizens said that that's about 660 security personnel for one delegate. Apart from that, they also sealed off the borders with Nepal, with Myanmar and with India in order to prevent people from coming in. And you know whom they meant when they spoke about people. The effect of all this, including of the Poshilai incident, was to my mind evident in the selections done or in the composition of the Politburo Standing Committee. Firstly, the Politburo Standing Committee was reduced in size from 9 to 7. Now, this is something that has been going on for quite a while, and we've been hearing reports about it for over a year. But the 7 who were selected, 2 of them were already designated candidates, namely Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang. But the other 5 who have been appointed and who are now Politburo Standing Committee members, which means the 7 people who actually in effect run China, are all conservative elements. And I'll just mention 1 or 2 of them. The first whom I would identify is Li Yunshan, who is the Politburo Standing Committee member, who continues to oversee propaganda, culture, and the cyberspace to that extent. He was a conservative and a very strong director of the propaganda department. He was, you may recall, in charge of the propaganda apparatus in 2008 during the riots, when he managed it in such a way that it shaped the narrative at that time, and in fact drove a wedge between the Han majority and the Tibetans at that time. And we are seeing the effects of that propaganda effort even till today, when there are reports of clashes between Han students and Tibetan students that keep taking place in middle schools and senior middle schools across China. He has also been given additional responsibility of the Central Party School, which is an important place where all the people who are marked for higher posts in the party and in the army, they go through the Central Party School, and he's in charge of that. He's also, importantly, member of the Secretariat of the Central Committee, which has been reconstituted, and which seems that it's going to be a more influential body than the previous Secretariat. There's one Politburo Standing Committee member, and there are 4 Politburo members on that Secretariat, which reports directly to Xi Jinping. Of special interest to, I think, the gathering here would be the fact that the Secretariat includes Li Yunshan, who has this background of Tibet, and it also includes Tu Qinglin, who, in fact, people thought would be retiring. I mean, he was 67 years of age, and that's normally the time when they get ready to be eased out of office. But he was brought into the Central Committee Secretariat, and when you look at that, along with the appointment of Ko Chin-long as the party secretary of Beijing, again a person with experience in Tibet, many years of experience in Tibet, and Ling Chi-hua's appointment as director of the United Front Department, it would appear that an initiative is in the offing on Tibet by Xi Jinping and his team. The other important facet of power in China is the army. And here again, some interesting things happened coinciding with the party congress. This time, we saw that the appointments to all the principal departments of the PLA had been completed before the party congress got underway. In fact, well before. And each one of the persons who was appointed is a person who owes his promotions and who is a loyalist of Hu Jintao. To my mind, this would indicate that Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping have worked closely together in the military sphere and otherwise, and there is going to be a continuation of the policy that Hu Jintao had initiated. There are 5 princelings in the Central Military Commission, apart from signifying that the princelings are on the rise. But these 5, of them 3 have come out in public with fairly tough statements on the South China Sea issue. And I mention this because it is indicative of their mindset as to how China should handle disputes with its neighbors. Xi Jinping, meanwhile, has moved very rapidly after the party congress in 2 spheres. One, he has shown his commitment to pursuing the economic reform policies set out by Hu Jintao. But this is qualified. When he talks about economic reforms, he talks about graduated reforms. And he recently made a speech, I think it was just about 3 days ago, where he spelt out the various steps that the economic reforms have to take. And these are in accordance with the policies that were worked out with Hu Jintao, which is one of common prosperity or an inclusive growth, and not letting some get rich first. The second thing was his trip to Guangdong. It was, of course, a lot of analysts pointed out that it was reminiscent of Deng Xiaoping's southern tour, and at a time when reforms had threatened to stall, and Deng Xiaoping wanted to give them a push. That, of course, is there, and that was the message. But there were 2 other messages that were also transmitted at the same time. One was that Xi Jinping was making a point of stressing frugal living and a simple lifestyle. And the Hong Kong media, which picked up the visit first, showed his entourage traveling throughout those 4 places that he visited in minibuses with a police escort, but with no disruption to traffic and no disruption to the people. They also showed him on occasion mixing with the common people. So this was one point that was made, and subsequently on the 4th of December, a circular has been issued laying down what the party cadres should do and what they cannot do during inspection visits along the same lines. The second is, I think, also an important point for analysts to consider, and that is this vision of the Chinese dream. This was first, it came out during the party congress, but it was really fleshed out by the cadres, not so much by Xi Jinping, who only made a couple of references to it. But this Chinese dream is something which I understand was being formulated as far as 3 years ago. So which indicates that Xi Jinping was very clear as to where he's headed and what policies he's going to follow. And Wang Huning was the person who was closely associated with this Chinese dream. And essentially, the Chinese dream incorporates three things. The first is higher incomes for Chinese. The second is a better environment for the Chinese. And the third is a strong nation. And here, Xi Jinping's repeated references to rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, I think, are significant. That implies not only a strong China, but it also implies, or it recalls, the humiliation that China has suffered at the hands of foreigners, thereby making China's position with regard to negotiations or concessions on issues of sovereignty or territorial integrity more inflexible. Finally, I think the new leadership's agenda is going to be somewhat different from that of its predecessors. The first item that they will tackle are the domestic issues and primarily the economy. They have to keep the prices at an acceptable level. They have to control inflation, and they'll be working to that. There's a slight difference here, though, between their policy red lines and that of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao. The first is that in his latest speech, Li Keqiang, the premier, spoke of a 7.5% growth rate, but in other conversations, there are references to an 8% growth rate. And I think that is linked to the fact that unemployment is something that they have to tackle, and they have to try and work on creating more jobs. A 7% growth rate makes that somewhat difficult, and today there is a situation where the graduates coming out of colleges are complaining that they're not getting jobs, and the officials are clarifying that there are enough jobs available, but they're not of the type that the graduates want. So that's the difference there. There is also a lot of resentment among the demobilized PLA soldiers. And at the time of the party congress last year, in fact, there was a group of PLA soldiers in Liaoning who claimed to speak for 60,000 other demobilized soldiers and listed a lot of, they had a long list of complaints about non-payment of dues, etc. If that kind of thing catches on, it will mean more serious trouble for the new leadership, which is also why the new leadership is unlikely to move strenuously on the issue of reform of the SOEs. It would mean more unemployment, more worker layoffs, and I don't think they're prepared for that. There is, however, going to be a reduction in the size of the bureaucracy, and we'll see fewer ministries probably being proposed by March next year. In fact, one of the ministries that is proposed to be done away with is the Ministry of State Security, which will be merged with our National Security Bureau. The second issue that they have, while looking at domestic issues, is that of Tibet. And to my mind, that is a matter which causes them very serious concern. When it comes to Xinjiang Uyghur, they look at that as basically a law and order or terrorist issue. The Uyghurs have taken to arms, and they can be sorted out the same way. So the tactic they follow there is to isolate the area where there is a problem, blank out any exposure or access to the media, and then, if I may use the term, neutralize the problem and carry on. With Tibet, it's different. They're just not able to understand why, when they're pumping in a lot of money, when they're trying to work for the development of Tibet, why the people are not accepting of the communist rule, of Chinese communist rule. They've now gotten a new party secretary who is following, apparently chosen by Xi Jinping, and he has brought in a policy where he is accelerating economic development, particularly in the urban centers in Tibet. At the same time, by his own admission, he has increased the number of police stations across Tibet in order to ensure that response time to any incident does not exceed 3 to 5 minutes. He has also strengthened the party's presence, and there is a presence now in every village in the Tibet Autonomous Region. He has also increased party surveillance, and as he said in a recent interview, or well, not very recent, in September, there are photographs of Mao, Tang, Chiang Zemin and Hu Jintao in every monastery in Tibet. So they have stepped up that, in addition to creating a cadre of people who are monitoring the monasteries and the monks. So they are trying that kind of, they're making that kind of move. At the same time, there are indications that Xi Jinping is contemplating some kind of an initiative aimed at the Tibetan community abroad and possibly inside Tibet. Abroad, there was a recent case of a visitor to Dharamsala who met the Dalai Lama and the Sichong and Ugen Thinle, the Gyalwa Karmapa. Nothing much has come of it, but it indicates that the leadership is looking for ways to try and diffuse the tension that exists today, where the spate of self-immolations is unending. And one of the methods, I think, is to try and again recommence the negotiations or the dialogue that was going on, if at all that is possible. But that is an initiative that will take place. Along with that, and what is of direct relevance to us in India, is the increased activity in Nepal. Nepal is viewed by the Chinese as the launchpad from where the US and the Dalai Lama will try and instigate trouble in Tibet. And that's why they've increased their presence there, and they've certainly become more active, particularly their counselor and the defense attaché in coordinating with the Nepalese government. There are also all kinds of plans which are being brought in. The third aspect of the Chinese policy is an increased effort to contact and interact with high-ranking lamas in order to win them over, and also at the same time to undermine the Dalai Lama's position. They're looking, of course, to a regime in the post phase where they expect that the Tibetan community will be leaderless, and that is the time they will try to strike. So these are the moves that they're making at the moment. Taiwan is not such a major issue for them. They feel it's in a state of, shall we say, passive improvement, so they're not really concerned. And that brings us to the South China Sea, which is what I think will be at the top of their agenda and the foreign policy sphere, where this administration, Xi Jinping's administration, will continue to push the envelope. I don't think there will be any chance of a compromise or negotiation. Their effort will be to use their economic leverage as well as military strength to try and carve down the neighbors and get them to accept the Chinese position. Of course, short of a clash. And they will not want a clash with the US either. As far as India is concerned, what we do see is unceasing pressure on India in the form of incursions, in the form of Chinese activities in our neighborhood, in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, where of course the stage is being set for a contest with the US, and probably in Bhutan. These are the new areas where they are moving in more actively. The number of exercises that the PLA has been organizing, including integrated joint exercises across our borders, have increased in size and in number. And I think in the last 10 months, there are some people here who can correct me if I'm wrong, the figure would be about 6 major exercises that have taken place. And that's something that is a source of constant pressure. The new kinds of aircraft that have been deployed and additional aircraft that have been deployed in Tibet. There is also no change in their policy of restricting India in its within the South Asian region. And in fact, one of the points that they point out, or one of the factors they point out as causing friction between India and China are India's regional aspirations or India's growing aspirations. They want to contain that, and which is why there is no question of their supporting India in the UN for a UNSC seat, despite vague comments on that. They are in fact increasing the ambit of their claims in Arunachal Pradesh and in J&K. They have now started contacting and exerting pressure successfully on international organizations, preventing them from giving development assistance to projects in Arunachal Pradesh. I expect the next step would be in J&K. So they are trying all this. They have also gone on record and made at least 4 to 5 comments in their official media, saying that in the context of sorting out their border issues with various countries, including maritime issues, there is no question in their mind that they will have to go to war, that finally the issues will have to be resolved through conflict. In the context of the South China Sea, they look at 2 countries with whom a clash is likely, and that is India and Japan. And they say that if such a situation does come about, they will choose the bigger of the 2, which is India. The reason, again, has been spelled out, which is to signal to all the countries around and in the South China Sea that big countries like India and Japan cannot come to their assistance, and neither can the US, and therefore they're on their own and would be better off accepting Chinese dominance in the region. So this is a brief outline sketch of how I see the new leadership, of how I see the Chinese Communist Party. There are problems, serious problems that China faces, but I don't see the Chinese Communist Party itself crumbling or weakening in a major sense, at least over the next 5 to 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much.